Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you raised, someone whose scraped knees you once kissed, and seen a stranger staring back? That was the moment I realized my children were no longer mine. Not in the way a mother hopes they'll always be. It started with a letter. A thick, cream-colored envelope slipped through the slot of our old oak door one quiet Tuesday morning, a few weeks after my husband's funeral. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, formal, deliberate, the kind that belonged to lawyers. My heart sank before I even touched it. I had spent 40 years beside Edward, through wealth and ruin and wealth again. I thought I knew everything about him. But as I slid open that envelope with trembling fingers, I realized how wrong I was. The will was simple enough. Edward had left everything to me. $50 million, properties across 3 states, and shares in the company he built from the ground up. My name stood alone. No conditions. No complications. Just my name. It should have felt like security, like love that transcended even death. Instead, it felt like a storm waiting to break. When my children arrived that evening, Daniel, the eldest, with his tailored suit and impatient tone, and Clara, my youngest, carrying her grief like an accessory rather than a burden, I felt the weight of something unspoken between us. They had been distant during Edward's illness, too busy, too distracted. But now, as they sat across from me in the living room, their eyes fixed on the copy of the will in my hands, I recognized something sharper. Expectation. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice coated with forced calm, "Dad wouldn't have wanted you to deal with all this alone. You know how complicated his finances were." Clara nodded, her smile small and tight. "You've always said we'd handle things as a family." It wasn't their words that frightened me. It was the familiarity of them. They spoke like their father, with that same measured logic that disguised control. "I'll manage," I said softly, though my voice wavered. "Your father trusted me with everything. I intend to honor that." Daniel's jaw clenched. "It's not about trust, Mom. It's about fairness." Fairness. That word cut deeper than I expected, because in that moment I saw it, the flicker of resentment, the calculation behind their eyes. My children weren't mourning their father anymore. They were measuring my worth against his money. That night, after they left, I sat alone in the quiet hum of the house Edward and I built together. Every shadow seemed to whisper a question I wasn't ready to face. How far would my own children go to take what was mine? And as the wind pressed against the windows, I realized that love, real, maternal love, was no guarantee against betrayal. It was only the beginning of it. When Edward and I met, he was a man with nothing but ambition in his pockets and a quiet fire in his eyes. We married young, too young, my mother used to say, and built our life piece by piece, like a house made of fragile glass. Every success came with sacrifice. I worked long hours at a local clinic while he turned late nights into million-dollar ideas. We lived modestly for years, saving every penny until his inventions, medical devices that changed the way rural hospitals operated, brought us a kind of wealth neither of us had imagined. But money has a way of rearranging people. I saw it first in Edward's eyes, then later in our children's. Daniel grew up watching his father work, absorbing his precision, his hunger. By the time he was 16, he was already mimicking Edward's confidence, sharp, proud, and slightly detached. He wanted to inherit not just his father's business, but his authority. Clara, on the other hand, was different, artistic, sensitive, the one who used to crawl into my bed after a nightmare and ask if people could stop loving each other. For years, I believed she understood me more than anyone else. But wealth blurs the lines between love and entitlement. When Edward's company expanded overseas, Daniel joined him, and the two became inseparable in business. Clara, who once painted portraits of our family, stopped painting altogether. Instead, she began managing Edward's charity fund, turning compassion into calculation. Somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing us as parents. They saw us as pillars of fortune waiting to fall. When Edward's health began to fail, his once commanding voice softening into whispers, I was the one by his side, day after day. I fed him soup when his hands trembled, read to him when he couldn't sleep, held his hand when the doctors stopped offering hope. The children visited, yes, but always briefly. Daniel with his phone in hand, Clara with tears that felt rehearsed. Edward never complained, though I noticed his disappointment linger behind every forced smile. A week before he passed, he asked me to sit beside him in the study. The late afternoon light fell across his face, and for the first time in years, he looked at me not as a business partner's wife, but as the woman he'd built everything with. "I've made arrangements," he said quietly. "You'll be taken care of. They'll understand in time." I wanted to ask what he meant, but his voice cracked, and I let it go. It wasn't until that letter arrived, the will, his final word, that I understood the weight of his decision. Edward had trusted me to keep our world intact. But as the days after his funeral stretched into uneasy silence, I began to sense something shifting beneath the surface. Daniel's calls became more frequent, Clara's visits more calculated. They were circling me gently, politely, like predators testing the air before the hunt. And I, foolishly hopeful, still believed love might protect me. The first sign came quietly, so quietly I almost dismissed it. Daniel stopped calling me Mom. It wasn't deliberate, not at first. He'd replace it with Mother during business conversations, as if I were an associate, not the woman who raised him. "Mother, the financial advisor needs your signature." "Mother, the estate tax filings can't wait." There was a coldness in the word, a boundary that hadn't been there before. Clara, on the other hand, became more affectionate, too affectionate. She started dropping by unannounced, always with a smile and a basket of pastries I never asked for. She'd sit beside me on the couch, her hand resting lightly on mine as she spoke in that soft, soothing tone she used to use when she wanted something as a child. "Mom," she'd say, "Daniel's just worried about you. We all are. 50 million is a lot to handle alone. Maybe you should let us help." Her words sounded innocent enough, but I knew manipulation when I heard it. Years of raising two children had taught me to recognize the subtle choreography of guilt and charm. At first, I tried to reason with them. I told them I didn't need help, that I wanted time to grieve before making any financial decisions. But grief, to them, was an inconvenience, an obstacle between them and what they believed they deserved. One evening, I found Daniel in Edward's study, Edward's private sanctuary, the one room I'd left untouched since his passing. Daniel sat behind his father's desk, flipping through old ledgers and contracts. He didn't even look up when I entered. "You shouldn't be in here," I said quietly. He smirked, that familiar half-grin of his father's. "It's just business, Mom. Someone has to keep things in order now that Dad's gone." I folded my arms, steadying my voice. "Your father left that to me." He looked up then, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "And do you really think you can handle it? You've never dealt with the company's finances. Dad built an empire. Are you planning to manage that from the kitchen table?" The word stung, but I refused to let him see it. "Your father trusted me because I stood by him when no one else did. Don't mistake patience for weakness." For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Maybe guilt, maybe doubt, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He shut the ledger and walked past me, muttering, "We'll see about that." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house in silence, the air thick with memories. The portraits on the walls, the children's school photos, the vacations, Edward's awards, felt like ghosts watching me, silently judging my inability to hold this family together. The next morning, Clara arrived early, uninvited as usual. She brought coffee and muffins, her smile bright but strained. "I talked to Daniel," she said carefully. "He's being protective. Maybe if we just sit down with an attorney, we can make things clear. No fights, no confusion." I almost agreed, until I saw the papers in her bag. Pre-drafted transfer documents. My name printed neatly at the bottom, awaiting my signature. "Clara," I said softly, "what is this?" She froze, her eyes darting between the papers and my face. "It's just a formality. We thought it'd be easier if I handed over what your father left me." Her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, her polished calm cracked. It's not like that, Mom. You don't understand how complicated these things are. No, I said, my voice trembling with something between anger and heartbreak. You don't understand. Your father trusted me, not you. And now you're standing here trying to take from me what he gave out of love. Tears welled in her eyes. It's not fair. He gave you everything. What about us? There it was, the truth, raw and ugly. Not grief. Not misunderstanding. Envy. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You were never left out, Clara. You were loved. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. Later that week, I noticed strange things happening. Bank statements missing. Phone calls from financial institutions I didn't recognize. And one evening, my account balance showed a withdrawal I hadn't made. I called Daniel immediately. Do you know anything about this? There was a pause on the line before his calm, practiced voice replied, Mom, everything's under control. You just need to trust us. Trust. The word echoed bitterly in my chest. I hung up without saying goodbye. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't just losing my husband's fortune, I was losing my children. Not to death, but to greed. And I didn't know which was worse. The truth revealed itself not in one grand moment, but in 100 tiny details that, once aligned, became impossible to ignore. It started with a phone call from Edward's longtime accountant, Mr. Walters, a soft-spoken man who had served our family for decades. His tone was hesitant, uneasy. Mrs. Harrington, he began. I wasn't sure if I should call, but there's something you ought to know. He told me that several large transfers had been made from my joint inheritance accounts. Funds moved discreetly through a newly established trust, one that bore a familiar name, the Harrington Legacy Fund. The signatures on the authorization forms looked almost perfect. Almost. Who signed them? I asked, though part of me already knew. A silence stretched over the line before he answered. Your children, ma'am. Daniel and Clara. My knees went weak. I sank into Edward's old chair, the same one he'd sat in the night before he died. I could almost hear his voice in the quiet. They'll understand in time. But they hadn't. They'd stolen from me, systematically, deliberately. The realization hit harder than grief itself. I called Daniel first. His tone was casual, even rehearsed. Mom, calm down. It's not what you think. We just moved some assets around for tax efficiency. Tax efficiency? I repeated, my voice shaking. You took my husband's legacy and turned it into your own. Without my consent. Without your knowledge, he corrected smoothly. There's a difference. You're not equipped to handle these accounts, Mom. Dad would have wanted. Don't you dare speak for your father. I snapped. He left everything to me for a reason. There was a pause, then Daniel's voice softened, almost pitying. You're making this harder than it needs to be. It's just money. Just money. I whispered. You've destroyed what's left of this family for just money. When I hung up, my hands were trembling so violently I could barely hold the phone. A part of me wanted to believe it was a mistake, that maybe Clara, my gentle Clara, had been dragged into this by her brother's ambition. So I called her next. She answered almost immediately. Mom? Daniel told me you'd be upset, but please let me explain. Explain how you forged my signature? I interrupted. Explain how you looked me in the eye while stealing from me? Her breath hitched. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Daniel said we'd fix it before you noticed. We just wanted what was ours. You don't understand, Mom. You already have everything. Her words tore through me like glass. Everything. I repeated, my voice hollow. I lost my husband, my partner, the father who gave you both everything you ever had. And now you've taken the last piece of him from me. Mom, please, she whispered, crying now. We thought we were protecting the family. No, I said quietly, my chest tightening. You were protecting your greed. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I could hear her crying softly on the other end, the sound once capable of breaking my heart. But something inside me had shifted. The tears no longer reached me. That night, I sat in Edward's study with the documents spread before me. Every forged signature, every transaction, a trail of betrayal drawn in ink. I could almost feel him there beside me, his disappointment mingling with my pain. I didn't call the police. I didn't hire lawyers. Instead, I called Mr. Walters again and told him to freeze the accounts, all of them. If they want to fight for it, I said, my voice steady, let them. But not with my blessing. When I hung up, I realized I'd crossed an invisible line, the one between being a mother and being a woman who refused to be a victim. And as the night deepened, I finally allowed myself to cry, not for the money, not even for Edward, but for the children I'd loved too much to see clearly. In the weeks that followed, the house grew quieter than ever. Silence has a way of expanding. It filled every hallway, every corner of the life I once knew. The phone stopped ringing. The visits ceased. The only sound that kept me company was the ticking of the old clock Edward bought when we were first married, its rhythm steady and unbothered, like time itself mocking my grief. Daniel and Clara didn't come back. Not to apologize, not to argue. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard they'd hired lawyers, though the case never reached court. Once the accounts were frozen, they realized there was nothing left to take, not legally, not morally. The money sat untouched, like a ghost between us. I thought the loneliness would destroy me, but it didn't. It stripped me bare, yes, but in the emptiness that followed, I found something I hadn't felt in years, clarity. I began sorting through Edward's things. Old letters, photographs, the faint scent of his cologne clinging to his jackets. And as I packed away the remnants of our shared life, I began to see him differently. Not as the man who built an empire, but as the man who tried, in his final act, to protect me from the very people we'd raised. One morning, I found an old envelope tucked inside his desk drawer. My name, written in his familiar hand. Inside was a note, brief but heavy with meaning. If they ever forget who they are, remind them who you are. For the first time I understood. The money had never been the point. It was a test, a mirror held up to all of us. Edward had trusted me not to lose myself when everything else fell apart. So I didn't fight them. I didn't seek revenge. I donated half of the inheritance to a foundation in Edward's name, funding medical care for families who had nothing. The rest, I placed in a trust, one my children would never control, but one that would always carry their father's name. Sometimes I still see them in my dreams. Daniel, serious and distant. Clara, tearful but unreachable. I wake up aching, but no longer angry. Because love, I've learned, isn't measured by what we give, but by what we choose not to take back. And though my children stole the fortune meant for me, they could never steal what I finally reclaimed, my peace.